I've read in numerous secondary sources and even heard it in a few YouTube videos that after King Henry V died at the Château de Vincennes near Paris in August of 1422, his body was boiled in a gigantic pot in preparation for his repatriation to England for burial in Westminster Abbey. Having just addressed the issue of Catherine of Valois' post-mortem treatment, I thought it might be fun, if fun is the right word, to briefly address the evidence for this too. Now, preserving bodies through boiling was a mortuary custom that was on occasion practised in medieval Europe. This method was known in Latin as Mos Teutonicus, which means the German custom, and it was primarily a pejorative term used by the French. It was a mortuary practice that was performed primarily on the corpses of very high-status individuals, and it was popularised by the Crusaders, who wanted burial back home in Europe if they died in the Holy Land. Now, the heat of the Holy Land and the distance between their place of death and their home required a very radical response if their wishes were to be fulfilled. During the process of Mos Teutonicus, the body of the deceased was usually dismembered, and then it was boiled in either water or wine so that the bones could be defleshed. The defleshing was usually performed with a sharp knife, and bodies that have been studied archaeologically that have been subjected to this treatment, such as the remains of Henry VII of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, who is buried in Pisa, display knife marks on those cleaned bones. The Catholic Church was not condemnatory of this grisly practice when it first began, but attitudes to it among churchmen did change in the late 13th century. In 1299, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal bull entitled De Sepulturis, which condemned the practice on pain of excommunication. Persons cutting up the bodies of the dead, the bull read, barbarously cooking them in order that the bones can be separated from the flesh so that they may be carried for burial into their own countries, are, by the very fact, excommunicated. By the early 15th century, when Henry V died, the practice was really frowned upon, particularly in France and England. There were at the time, as we will see, other more reasonable mitigations against putrefaction that did less violence to the integrity of a corpse. So what is the primary source or sources that suggest that Henry was prepared for his burial using the method of Mos Teutonicus, and is it a reliable source? Well, there is only a single source, a contemporary Latin chronicle of the life of King Charles VI of France. The bulk of this chronicle was written by a monk of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in Paris called Michel Pintoin, who was very well informed and was Charles's official chronicler. He died in 1421, and the remainder of the chronicle, including the bit that refers to Henry's death, was completed by another hand, perhaps by Pintoin's assistant Jean Chartier, who would go on to be the official chronicler to King Charles VII. The section that relates to Henry V's post-mortem preparation reads as follows. King Henry passed away at the age of 40 years or thereabouts, and his body was torn and dismembered, and the parts were boiled in a large dish with boiling water. Then the parts and bones of the said corpse were enclosed in a leaden box with a large quantity of spices, and the water, in which the parts of the said body had boiled, were placed in a certain cemetery. As the official chronicler of the Valois dynasty, there may be good reason to doubt the testimony of the monks of Saint-Denis. The Valois were of course in conflict with Henry and the Plantagenets. Remember that Mos Teutonicus was a practice that was frowned upon in France in this particular period, so one wonders if the account is propaganda. All the other chroniclers writing about King Henry V's death and funeral, and there are a good number, don't mention this grisly process at all. The English chronicler who wrote the Latin Vita et Gesta Henrici Quinti, the life and deeds of Henry V, writes, the royal body was seasoned with spices, clothed in waxed linen most secure, and a multiplicity of leaden webs, according to the custom required and customary in such business, wrapped in a wooden chest and covered with wax cloth. The French chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet says, that the king's body was well embalmed and was put into a coffin of lead. Now, what these two chroniclers describe in contrast to the monks of Saint Denis is the standard process of late medieval embalming, the method practiced on most late medieval and early modern English and French kings, whether they died at home or abroad. This method first involved the bowling or the evisceration of the corpse and the burial of the entrails in a church or churchyard. Indeed, Enguerrand de Montrelet says that Henry's entrails were buried in the abbey church of Saint-Maur-des-Fossés, a mile or so from the Château de Vincennes. Interestingly, during excavations in 1750, a lead casket containing the king's entrails was indeed discovered within the ruins of the abbey, proving de Montrelet correct. The casket apparently came to light in 1978, and a British MP called for their repatriation to England. The evisceration removed from the body the bacteria found in the bowels, which are where putrefaction generally begins in a corpse. After bowling, a corpse was then spiced, the body cavity might be filled with herbs, and it was then bamed, in other words anointed with oil infused with sweet-smelling herbs. This was followed by the tight wrapping of the body in layer upon layer of cloth dipped in beeswax, known as cerecloth. The wrapped body was then soldered into a lead shell that was formed around the shape of the corpse. These processes also inhibited decay rather well by removing the source of bacteria and creating anaerobic conditions that slowed down decay. This image shows the interior of King Henry VII's burial vault at Westminster Abbey under his tomb and depicts the figure hugging lead coffins surrounding the wrapped corpses of Henry VII. Although Henry V died in August of 1422, the distance between Paris and England was not so very great, and the time between his death and his burial, a little over 2 months, was pretty normal by late medieval standards. Kingly funerals were never quick affairs. The conventional embalming of the body, its wrapping in cerecloth and sealing lead described in most of the chronicles, would be sufficient mitigation against physical decay for this period of time, even during a warm autumn. Now, the space underneath the tomb of King Henry V has never been properly investigated. He's one of the only kings and queens buried in Westminster Abbey whose coffin has not been disturbed since his burial, so we will never know which of the sources is actually correct and whether Henry V was boiled or embalmed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.